In these troubling times, it's important to keep in mind what the state of things are, because these are not normal times we're living in. The cost of everything is going up. Gas is up over $4 a gallon, and frames per second costs are at an all-time high. Used to be on my salary, I could expect to earn about 60 frames a second, but with inflation, I'm only getting about 30, and sometimes when things are really tight financially, I may only get 20. Times are tough, but why are they tough? Who creates this inflated cost of frames? You guessed it, friends, FromSoft. How? By giving you less frames for the same amount of money, FromSoft is effectively raising the cost to well over double. But why? Well, why does the capitalist do anything? To make more money. And he'll tell you all kinds of things to justify it. I had to hire more art staff because we decided to make a gigantic open world nobody asked for. Or I had to give the staff a raise, but you only gave them 50 cents, and you raised my cost of my frames to over $1.50. Something is terribly wrong with FromSoft. You're gonna hear me sucking this game's dick a lot, probably. I'm gonna try and be unbiased. This is like my favorite fucking studio, so. Good God. Where do I even start with this? Well, what did other people think of this?
Open world games I've ever played.
Into something that will go down in history as one of the all-time greats.
Ooh, yeah. I'm gonna have to go ahead and sort of disagree with you there.
Well, as you probably already know, lots of people really like this game. In fact, puzzlingly enough, they love it. Like, they want FromSoft inside them so they can finally be called From Hard. I bought the game on PC because, well, why wouldn't I? It's not like I or anyone else I know or have even met or have brushed up against in an elevator has a PS5 right now, so what am I gonna do? Play it at 30 FPS on a console with a shitload of input lag? Nah, I wanted it on PC so I could run it faster at higher quality. Well, joke's on me because as a sick turn of events, my PC can only run the damn thing at 30 FPS anyway, and sometimes I go as low as 16 frames. Now look, it generally runs fast enough, but when I get a sudden stutter in the middle of a boss fight, which, contrary to what some game reviewers would have you believe, does happen, and it usually results in death. When that does happen, I can tell you that snapping my controller in half has crossed my mind more than once. Now, I can deal with all this. I mean, I haven't had to deal with this since Blood 2 was released, but screw it, whatever, I can deal. I can push through. I can grit my teeth and bear it. You know what I can't bear in my fast-paced action game where one wrong move can result in my death? It's the one thing as a player you don't want your enemies to do, and that is to suddenly become invisible while you're fighting them. Or when you get done fighting a boss, and in the middle of your save, your game crashes, forcing you to fight him again. Or how about when you get on your horse, and this happens? Look, my fucking horse has been invisible this entire time. Or when you get on your horse and he gets super shy and goes invisible while you're trying to do platforming.
Open world games I've ever played.
Or how when your frame rate drops so low that your inputs won't register constantly.
Into something that will go down in history as one of the all-time greats.
And then, after all of this, you go out onto the internet to find everyone's praising the game, and you think to yourself, am I crazy? Am I playing a different game than these people? And then you go to Steam, and you know that everything is right in the world. And contrary to what people are saying, this game was not review bombed. This game was reviewed by the people who bought it on PC. So knowing all this, why the hell did I put 70 hours into this game in a week? This review is going to be spoiler free. I'm only going to be showing the first couple of hours of gameplay, so you don't have to worry about that, alright? So let's get in there. Oh my god, what? What the fuck? Okay, so they just randomly go invisible. That's pretty cool. The graphics are pretty typical for a FromSoft game, and that's to say that they're very good looking. I'd even go so far as to say they're handsome. Not because of graphical fidelity or anything like that. In fact, well, these characters look a bit like what we thought people looked like when we carved them into marble, which is to say, pretty damn ugly. But the weapons, the armor, the spell effects, the environmental art, the art in general, yeah. It's all pretty fantastic. So on one hand, you got really nice looking graphics over here, and you got really ugly ones over here. It's very Taoist of them. But what about that flair that FromSoft has in designing not just interesting art styles, but interesting environments? Well, that takes a while to shine through all the grime and grit that the frame rate on PC and the disappearing enemies hide. How do you fix the disappearing enemies? Well, some sites recommend you do things like restart your game. Doesn't work. Reinstall the game. Doesn't work. Clear the shader cache. Doesn't work. Go to a different area in the game. Well, that might work. Depends on the area. But you know, that's not really a solution. I am eventually gonna have to go to that area. So what's likely gonna happen is that I'm gonna try and get really good at fighting invisible enemies, you know, hone my other senses, see through my hearing eye. And really, like, what if this was just the part of the plan the whole time? Like, maybe Miyazaki thought the game wasn't hard enough, so he thought, hey, you know, I bet I know something we could do. We can make the enemies disappear right in front of the player. That'll make the game pretty hard, huh? What's happening here? Well, it appears that when the game is getting really taxing for your machine, certain objects will be set to disappear and stop rendering as to not halt the game in its tracks. That means that render priority, which means what gets rendered when the frame rate drops beyond a certain point, is set to the objects in the environment and not the most important thing in the environment either. You know, the enemies. I have no freaking clue why anyone in the history of game design ever would want the enemies to disappear before the props in an area, but it's kind of like a devil's bargain, isn't it? Which objects are needed the most? The enemies that could kill me, or the props that could kill me when I run into them and get stuck? Since the game came out, there's been a lot of speculation about how long it'll take FromSoft to actually fix this issue, and as a person who's been studying pretty intensely the optimization methods for something like Unreal 5, I could tell you, optimization is not some simple process that you could just slap on at the end of the development of a game. Optimizing a game takes tasks like the following. Texture atlasing. What's that, you ask? Texture atlasing is one way that a developer might try to optimize their game. Say you have an object like a building, and that building is made up of like 30 objects like the walls, the doors, the windows, the roof, and so on. And each of these objects has its own texture. Well, each of those textures is one draw call from the GPU to your screen. To understand this better, what a draw call is basically instructions that the CPU sends the GPU to render out certain vectors. Right? Like the coordinates of a three-sided polygon. So each instruction that the CPU has to decode essentially and send to the GPU is overhead on the CPU, and if there's too many draw calls, the CPU can get bottlenecked. It gets to be like trying to flush a big wad of paper towels down your toilet. So our building is about 60 draw calls all said and done with just a basic texture on them. Now what if you needed about 20 of these buildings all scattered throughout a big open world map? Those draw calls will start adding up really quick. We can cut those draw calls down to half that by putting all of the textures for all of those objects into one large texture file called a texture atlas, instead of having them each on their own texture file. It'll look something like this. The thing is, this isn't something you could just do at the end of a project because each object will now need its own texture and UV coordinates changed to the point in a new location in the atlas. But we still have 31 draw calls. Well, we can use static batching for the rest of these objects. Okay, but long story short, there's about 30 million different things you can do, right? You could do occlusion culling, which is when the camera only renders what's within the field of view. You can do backface culling. You can do all kinds of shit that will optimize the game, including cutting down the draw distance and having a heavier fog at distance. That occludes the player from seeing anything beyond a certain point. But it seems like they designed the draw distance to be this way on purpose because it's part of the actual level design, is being able to see where you're going to go if you go the long way around, right? Let us set our draw distance and I bet you that frame rate gets kicked up a notch. If it makes our experience worse or it's not getting across the vision you initially had and why you made the draw distance so long, that's okay. Some of us would rather get more performance than get prettier graphics, okay? Sorry, bud. The problem, though, gets even worse when you have shaders like normal maps and spec maps and diffusion and even light maps. Each texture file is one draw call, remember? So you can see how this starts to bloat the cost greatly. That 60 draw call object can become a 240 draw call object when you're using like PBR materials or a diffusion, normal, roughness, and ambient occlusion map. Now, why did I tell you all this? Because optimization is not something you could just start doing at the end of your project and call it a day. You need to start doing it the moment you put art in your game, or you're going to be spending months optimizing the game after release, or, what is more often the case, never optimize the game and hope that tech increases rendering abilities and everyone just forgets that your game ever ran like shit in the first place. Am I right, Cyberpunk? I trusted you, Cyberpunk. Optimization is not something they can just fix. It takes a big money and time commitment on their part. So ask yourself, do they stand to make any money from doing that? And I know I'm going to catch a lot of shit in the comments for this, but I don't care, you know, and I bring this stuff up because it's really important, because you guys have to start thinking about this kind of thing. If a game comes out and it's absolute dog shit, it's not going to get better. They're not going to invest all that time and money into that. That's the way the system works. You know, if you reward companies for putting out an inferior product and then you give it 10 out of 10s all over the damn place, then what you're normalizing is a game coming out for PC that doesn't run. Because you're showing the developer that you don't care. You gotta treat a corporation a little bit like how you gotta treat a dog, you know what I mean? Like if your dog takes a piss on the carpet, you don't immediately go run over to him and scratch him behind his ears and go, "Who's a handsome boy? Who's a good boy?" and then give him a treat. What's the dog gonna learn from that? And just in case you're thinking that my computer's just a piece of shit, let me remind you that I exceed the recommended, not the minimum, the recommended system specs that is listed on the Elden Ring Steam store page, okay? So if you watched a review and the reviewer mentioned the performance and said, "Don't worry, they'll patch it out," you might want to check your back pocket because I think someone just stole your wallet. Like, the open world feels just completely empty.
A few moments later.
Dude, oh my god. Guys, look at this shit. This game has a 97. You know, kind of weird, right? Don't you think? Level design. Typically, this is something that FromSoft excels at, though each game has a varying level of success in this regard. Dark Souls, in my opinion, had the best design if you're thinking about it from purely a player choice standpoint. You could go anywhere you wanted in that game, save for a few areas in the mid-game, but Bloodborne took what DS1 did and made it feel cohesive, like one big continuous world. Elden Ring takes all of that and chucks it right out the window of a moving car. Now the game is open world, and as far as open worlds are concerned, this is a pretty damn good one. It has its problems, and I'll talk about that soon, but to be honest, I didn't have high hopes for it in the beginning. This game is like so close to feeling like a more boring Dark Souls. It's very unfortunate. It actually took a really long time for the open world format to actually click with me, because I wasn't very satisfied with it at first. All I could think about is like what we lost, you know, that tight level design that FromSoft is kind of known for, right? It's one encounter after another, one combat puzzle after another. It constantly keeps you engaged, and there's very little downtime in between, which makes you even more grateful when there is downtime. You know, when you killed enough enemies and now it's time for you to just go look around and take in the environment and explore and look for hidden areas. Whereas this game, it's very loose. There's a lot of downtime in between, but that downtime, you could be spending that looking in every nook and cranny for items or for hidden areas, of which there are a million of them in this game. And some of them are expansive as hell when you find them, and you'll just be sitting there like, God, I can't believe that they did all of this and hid it behind a wall like they did in DS1. I mean, really, the open world is quite something, but like I said, it just didn't click with me at first. You can see that they took some inspiration from their old designs by treating zones in the game like regions that are all connected, but sometimes have one or two paths into the area using verticality. They use cliff faces to block off certain entrances into regions with mountains that are high enough to kill you if you fall from them, or by using sheer drops into the white cloudy void as barriers to late game areas that are cordoned off by various mid-game bosses, or just really tough enemies that prevent exploration of certain areas within regions. I like these areas especially because you get that powerful feeling of going back to an area that kicked your ass when you were a virgin, then going back to kick their ass once you've hit the gym and become a Chad. It's very satisfying to be the guy that takes the bully's lunch money for a change. It's not quite a Dark Souls 1 level of openness, but I don't hesitate when I say that what FromSoft did with this open world formula is just brilliant. The world is broken up into what is essentially two islands. The player is able to explore the world from the west coast to the east coast, though the final area to the east is a high level that you are likely going to want to come back to after you've beaten quite a few main bosses and advanced the story a little. And this opening area is huge. As you travel east, the land will become harsher, more inhospitable, which is a great way to take the Ubisoft formula of throwing a ton of shit on the screen and overwhelming the player with UI pointers, fish hooking their nostrils as they drag you from level 7 to a clearly labeled level 8 area. FromSoft has managed to do what it takes Western developers 90% of the screen real estate to do, and they managed to do it not only without UI hints, but without even a filled-in map. The decision to hide the map until you find a map of each region was another choice I absolutely love. The best part of the exploration are in those moments when you're simply wandering around, exploring, groping around in the dark, and when you finally do get a map, I found myself relying on it a lot more, but not in the way I might depend on it in a Western game. I'm using the map in Elden Ring to find places to explore, not because the map is littered with waypoints, but because that little scratching there, that little drawing, that might be some interesting place I want to check out. Or, what's that? I bet it's a cave. Is that a house? Oh, what are those ruins over there? Is that tree really that big? It's like finding a treasure map and trying to decipher the codes the pirate used to hide his gold. Basically, everything takes work in a FromSoft game. Work from the player. And it's not some grindy shit where you gotta kill the same mosquitoes for roughly 2 hours before going to the next zone. It's mental work. It forces the player to think. The outside is connected to the inside seamlessly. I never saw a loading screen unless I was fast traveling from one site of grace to another. And that's right. This game has fast travel and you'll be using it a lot. As I said, the game is huge and it forces you to backtrack a lot. This shouldn't be surprising. I mean, each subsequent title has had a lot of that, like, Metroidvania style gameplay. Some entrances to caves require a limited and rare item called a sword key. You stab these things through the top of imps' heads to bring down barriers, and there's eventually going to be an area that you're locked off to until you either buy or find a key to open it. There are other doors and barriers that require specific items to open, so it's always giving you reasons to go back to areas where you're likely stronger so you could bully the bullies once again. And in a way, that's how FromSoft makes the player feel like they're always tangibly getting stronger, and goddamn, do you ever get strong, but we'll talk about that in a minute. And just when you think you might be getting bored of the overworld, you hit the first cave system, or you stumble onto a whole new level underneath the earth and you realize, goddamn, this is a lot of game for $60. But then you get killed out of nowhere by an enemy that just started rendering and you're reminded why you feel that lingering sadness this whole time, because you had to experience this wonderful game in a way that will forever color how you feel about it in the future. The sound is nothing to write home about, but that's not because it's average or anything like that, but because we've heard all these things before. Some of these sounds have been around since Demon Souls. The weapons sound meaty, just like they always have, and if you have some bass in your speakers, you'll get a decent rumble out of it when a hammer slams into the ground. The slash of a sword has an appropriate slice, like an ASMR woman licking her lips, and a splash of blood that sounds like somebody beer pissing on a tarp. Voice acting is dripping with Sean Bean-like personality, and there really doesn't seem to be one bad performance in the game as far as I could see. Nothing was distracting, the tone felt appropriate. That's about the best you can hope for an action game's voiceover. The music, on the other hand, I don't really know what to tell you about that. It's hard to describe, the menu music is appropriately epic. Lots of percussions and horns. It feels like I'm watching the opening credits of a Marvel movie. But the music for the boss fights, the music while exploring, basically any other song, I couldn't really tell you that, because during the course of gameplay, I hardly noticed the music. So is that even important? I mean, when I'm playing a game, my field of vision narrows and all I'm focusing on is the screen and what's in front of me. Most of the time, I'm so focused on the enemy looking for his sudden clues to tell me about when he's going to attack, watching the wind up, trying not to panic, and when that arm starts to move, dodge out of the way and wait for my opening. In that time, I'm never focusing on the music, and honestly, that's a good thing. I don't want to be distracted by the music. I don't want anything to get in the way. In fact, I usually lower the music when I'm playing so as to not be distracted by it, or to have it not play higher than dialogue so I can hear everything an NPC has to say. And appropriately enough, the music rarely draws attention to itself. Preferring to rely on repeating patterns, deceptively simple rhythms, the game uses a lot of choral sounds, chants, and some songs just sound chaotic, which I guess is exactly what it must feel like to fight a dragon while you watch your teammates get melted by dragon breath. The music is appropriate. There's no showing off here. The songs are excellently composed but purposefully subtle. Just like with the game's graphics, the sound shows craftsmanship on the part of Yuka Kitamura, the sort of restraint that a professional with years of experience under a belt can master. Loved her work on Sekiro, and I loved it doubly here. The music to Limgrave is the standout track for me. Just like Firelink Shrine before it, this song will be the one you think about for hours after you've shut the game off. It's amazing how much sound and energy Yuka is able to put out on a string instrument. In fact, the song is so simple that it's kind of amazing that it gets stuck in your head at all. It's not about how many notes are played, but how those notes are played after all. Listening to how much power is in that one note when held on sustain, playing out as the melody repeats, yet holding on that key, creating this feeling of longing, of anticipation, then temporarily killing that hope as it fades out, then back in on a higher note. The payoff feels uplifting when it's colored with the tinge of cymbal rattling. It's powerful. She manages to do so much with so little. The percussion is often accented by horns or strings played in unison, low octave. The melody is the rhythm in some of these songs, and in the Limgrave music, when it transitions to combat, even though the melody is clearly different, you can hear the hints of the ambient Limgrave tune playing in the back there, reminding you of where you've been while carrying you forward to where you'll be. It's quite good. As far as sound design, the music is a real highlight in that it, more than other soundtracks, does what it sets out to do and more. It manages to sit in the background, whispering feelings into your brain, not telling you how you should feel, but nudging you further into what the game is already making you feel. Hey FromSoft, in your next patch, can you make it so that when I'm in the middle of a fucking boss fight, you don't return me to the fucking main menu? Is what you might say over and over again when you've gotten the boss down to a sliver of health and somehow he manages to kill you because maybe you were a little too greedy and you tried to get more than one hit in at a time. Is this game hard? Yeah, for a little while, but that's just because things are a lot different than what you're used to. I feel like we have this conversation every single time one of these games comes out, and I'm a little sick and tired of it. Do these games need an easy mode? Okay, look, maybe for you they need an easy mode. You could just as easily go out and download a mod. I don't care. Mod your game to your heart's content. Just don't play online. But the real problem is that the entire game is built around that specific difficulty level. If they didn't think that you were capable of overcoming that challenge, they wouldn't have made it this hard. Trust me, they want repeat customers. They don't want to turn people away. That's not the point of what they do for a living. They want you to keep coming back. They effectively have more confidence in your ability than you have patience to prove them right. Think about it like that. Now that my get good credentials are in order, let's talk about this game and the gameplay changes and the difficulty. This game is full of the same kind of bullshit that's always plagued these games, and by now most avid Souls players have gotten over these limitations and have learned how to avoid them. For the rest of us who have been complaining the entire time, this game changes nothing. And if you're new to the series, these problems will piss you off to the point of wanting to quit. because not only are you struggling with the controls, but also the difficulty. If you want this to be your first Souls game, understand that you're going to die a lot, and most of those deaths will be your fault, but that 2% of the time where your death is the result of a terrible frame rate, that 2% will feel more like 50%. If you think you can deal with that, just resign yourself to be terrible at the game for a little while until you understand things. And the time gap between incompetent and competent, this is going to vacillate greatly between players, depending on how quickly they pick up on cues that the game is trying to send them. Elden Ring attempts to fix some problems, but it ends up creating new ones, like the option to avoid walls when the camera is close to one. That fix is going to kill you and make you run off of cliffs, or fall off of platforms, or roll in the wrong direction and get hit. I recommend turning it off unless you like scaring your cats by screaming obscenities at your computer screen. The gameplay is fairly simple to explain at a bird's eye, so let's start there and zoom in a bit. 70% of your time is going to be spent fighting, and 25% of that time is going to be spent exploring, with the remaining 5% of that time looking at stats and adjusting them to get the most out of your build, because min-maxing is very important in this game. Not like it was in previous games. In the previous titles, you could get by with a weak build because the bosses, they weren't crazy HP sponges, you know? If you had a suboptimal build, fights would take longer, but you could get by once you knew what you were doing. In Elden Ring, these fights can take somewhere in the range of about 15 to 20 minutes if your build is suboptimal. This is not a good thing because one mistake in this game can kill you and end your run against the boss, but they've added a few ways to overcome this. Remember the posture mechanic from Sekiro? Well, they've, in part, brought it over to Elden Ring. The mechanic gives certain weapons a higher posture damage buildup, and when posture is broken, the enemy is vulnerable to critical attacks. So, say your main slot is a heavy hammer and your off slot is a rapier. You could use the hammer to stack posture, then switch to the rapier for the crit for that extra bit of damage. Every bit of help that you get is desperately needed because this game is much harder than other FromSoft games, at least at first. The first gate to your progress is Margit. He's designed to stand in your way until you figure out that either you're too weak to fight him, and you should be traveling east or south first to get a bit stronger, or you memorize his movesets. But it's not that simple. Every enemy has a range at which they're most susceptible to counterattacks. For instance, some bosses have jumping attacks that will trigger when you're a certain distance from the boss. If you sit at that distance, you could draw the enemy into an attack, then follow up with a hit of your own, and Margit is meant to be fought in that way. The problem is, if you do terrible damage, you'll be fighting him for a while, which gives you many more opportunities to screw up during that fight. You may realize at this point that health might be less important than having high damage, because if you learn the moves and how to draw them into certain attacks, being able to kill the boss in 2 to 8 hits becomes way more important to you, and I think that's what the game wants you to do. At some point in the game, everything clicked into place for me. I got stuck on a boss that attacked so fast that I couldn't simply dodge at every attack, and only hit him when he's in recovery. I had to change my tactics, so I started jumping some attacks and following up with a power attack. I noticed that some weapons cause more posture damage, and at a certain point, the enemy would stagger and I could get in a crit, even the bosses. So I started doing that a lot more, but it wasn't enough. I was doing terrible damage, and some of these bosses have to be taken out very quickly before their friends join the fight. On a whim, I decided to check out the Ashes of War system, and that's when my eyes were open. The Ashes of War were one of the most important new additions to this game. Well, it's not new, it's just essentially just weapon arts from Dark Souls 3, but massively improved and expanded upon. Certain ashes will have a damage modifier like Holy, Magic, Bleed, and so on. So what I did was try out 5 different builds. Yes, I played all the way up through Godric with 5 different builds before I found the one I wanted. On one of those playthroughs, I got a weapon drop. The Reduvia dagger had this cool weapon art where a blade of blood would shoot out for decent range and pretty decent damage. So I started an arcane build thinking that I could make this whole build work, and it worked pretty well for a while until I tried out an Ash of War on a regular ass rapier plus 13, which I could make it plus 13 because smithing stones are easier to find, but somber smithing stones are not. The ability I put on this rapier was this awesome looking bloody slash move. I tried it out on an enemy and I saw the damage and I was like, what? This is awesome. This is what a power fantasy should feel like. Walk into a boss fight, get one shot, figure out how to one shot that boss. What do you have? One Punch Fantasy Man. Some people have theorized that FromSoft will nerf Bleed and Faith, but I want to say that not only do I think they shouldn't do this, but this would ruin the game for me. I mean, yeah, maybe one shots are a bit much, but I still have to hit a boss about 10 times before killing him with my Bleed build, and I gotta say, that feels fair. Still provides a challenge while not feeling like a grind. Maybe you could nerf some things in multiplayer only, bring all that up to parity. I mean, the way I look at it is like this, right? Like, you don't want to take something that somebody has gotten used to using, right? And all of a sudden make that thing worthless by cutting out half of its damage, right? Like nerfing it to death. Because, like, yeah, you might have just brought it in line with all of the other weapons, but it's not as satisfying to use anymore. You understand? It might be fair, but it's not satisfying anymore because what I experienced previous to this was so much better than what I'm getting now and will be getting forever for the rest of the lifespan of the game. So instead of doing that, why don't you bring up all of the weak builds up to parity with the really strong builds so it's a more competitive environment? Maybe don't just make it a flat numbers game. Maybe give some weapons an ability against other weapons that sort of nullify each other, you know, like a whole paper, rock, scissors kind of deal. Because you know what they say, a rising tide lifts all ships. Like, a nerf is the most destructive and laziest way to handle a problem, right? Because essentially what you're doing is you're putting more thought into the design of the thing that caused the problem than you are in the fix for the problem that was caused by the design. And as an effect, you are putting the fix over in rank of importance than the game design itself, because of all of the things that your nerf is now going to change for your player. Unintended consequences of nerfing, you know what I mean? It's too early to tell right now for me, but what I can say is it feels really good to quit a boss fight in search of better gear, then finding something that blows away your expectations. It feels good because the game makes a promise to you early on. It says that if you stick around through the game, at the end of all this, you're going to become a god. And I'll be damned if it doesn't feel that way at the end of the day. If they do nerf any of this, then that wasn't their initial design intention. And if it wasn't, I have to ask, why isn't it? I mean, don't promise I could be a god and then make me feel like a weak ass throughout the duration. I always think that the appropriate level of challenge should feel like you're on equal footing with the enemy. If, by the end of a fight, you're both down to your last hit, the resulting feeling is either relief or palpable sadness. That's why this game works and others don't. There's no one unifying vision of what combat should feel like in most AAA games. That's the thing that difficulty levels ruin. Players all having similar but different experiences, a custom tailored experience that brings a community together through shared experiences and stories. Now that's what combat is like in a bird's eye view. Let's stare into this thing with a macro lens. Combat consists of defense and offense. Defense has been given a few more tools, but each tool it gains gives the player another offensive tool as well. It's both simple and elegant. For instance, jump allows you to jump over horizontal slashing attacks, and it allows you to get in an attack while you're doing it, unlike the dodge roll, which only allows you to dodge and attack only after the dodge animation is completed. The jump can only dodge horizontal attacks, however, and dodging can avoid most every attack in the game. It's all about finding openings to optimize your effectiveness, and no one tool can do every job effectively. If you see the enemies winding up to do a horizontal attack, you jump to avoid it, then power attack to build up that posture break. You're able to tell which attack is which due to the generous wind up most attacks have. If the sword is over his head, do a dodge roll. If the sword is to his side, jump and attack. If you're abusing the R2 power attack while jumping, you'll posture break a boss multiple times during a fight. There's some fights in this game that can be won only using jump power attacks. It's that powerful because a jumping power attack will almost always stagger an enemy, and if you could draw the enemy into attacking you at a horizontal attack, you can get easy staggers and, as a result, easy crits. It all works because the hitboxes seem a lot tighter now, and I've seen more attacks miss me by going over my my head or under me as I jump than I've ever seen in any other game. Well, I mean, you couldn't jump in the other games, but you know what I mean. You combine the frequency of which enemy swings horizontally and combine it with the improved hitboxes, and you now have integrated a new mechanic that feels intuitive once the player realizes they can use it to win fights, that is. This is like a culmination of all the other Dark Souls games that came before this, with all the mechanics and everything that you're expected to know, like parrying, dodging, blocking, stuff like that, right? So it's a culmination of all that plus a new mechanic, the jumping mechanic, that seems to be really throwing off a lot of people. And the reason why is I don't think that this game is very good at teaching the player how these mechanics work inside the game, right? Because it's relying too much on tutorial screens, and UX research has kind of proven at this point that tutorial screens are probably the worst way to teach somebody how to play your game. Because by the 5th tutorial screen, they're skipping it. And even if you tell the participant to actually read the tutorial screen, they don't retain the information because they're barely paying attention to what they're reading. In Sekiro, there were gameplay roadblocks that stood in your way until you learned the mechanic the game wanted you to learn, and it wouldn't let you move on until you learned it. So you were either going to have to sink or swim. This game doesn't do much of that, except that it does actually lead you down the wrong way. And I think it does that on purpose, but I think it does that on purpose to its own detriment. Because a lot of people who are complaining about the difficulty are also rushing straight to Godric and Magritte and finding out the hard way that they can't even come close to killing the guy because they're too weak. And that's true. So you need to do, exploration. Before you go north, you gotta go east. And the game doesn't really teach the player that very well because literally the first grace that you see when you come out of that cave is pointing you towards Godric. I don't know, man. It just seems like they should have pointed you in the way that the game actually wanted you to go. This game now has massive appeal, right, due to the open world, so a lot more people are going to be playing this who have never played a Dark Souls game before in their life. So they haven't learned by trial and fire that when you run into a boss that just absolutely wrecks your day, you're not supposed to be going that way. Some enemies are actually meant to go invisible, and when they reappear, they're either in front of you or behind you. Some enemies will throw smoke bombs and blind you, then swarm you. Some enemies will shoot you with a charge arrow from across the map with deadly accuracy. All of these design choices force the player to adapt to a new, and most of the time, unique problem. And in a nutshell, that's what I think most people love about the Dark Souls experience. It's a unique and intentional experience that one simply cannot get anywhere else. If you want to be successful in this game, there's a couple of things that you just can't do. The first thing is you cannot be nervous when you go into these fights. You have to be thinking straight. And one of the most common issues I see with people is that they will try and they will beat their head against one boss for hours on end, not realizing that the last couple of hours they've been playing, they've made absolutely no progress because they're tired, they're fatigued, they're not paying attention, they're not operating at the peak efficiency that they need to be operating at in order to beat this specific person. It's like there is something to be said about just putting the game down, walking away, and thinking to yourself about what you did, what you could do better, and coming up with a plan before coming back the next day. So to close up this whole easy mode discussion, I'm just going to say this. An easy mode is not needed. Curiosity is needed. Part of that's on the game, but the other part of that is all you.
One of his kind is sure to seek the Elden Ring.
Hey, wait a minute. Did she say Elden Ring?
The Golden Order.
They've only mentioned it about 8 times so far. I was just wondering if she was talking about the Elden Ring. The game's been bragging to me about its story for like 2 years now, ever since that first press release. And I just wanted to sit you down and tell you to stop bragging because now you're creating expectations. You know what I mean? Here I am sitting down at a table to enjoy a nice grilled cheese sandwich when Miyazaki strolls in and sits down next to me and says, "I got George R.R. Martin to write the story for my next game." And I look at him puzzled and say, "Who the fuck are you? And how did you get in my house?" Then I'm getting ready for bed and I look at my phone and I see a text message. He wrote, "You know the guy who wrote the Game of Thrones? He's writing my story. That's pretty neat, isn't it?" And I texted him back and I said, "I told you to stop texting me. I'm calling the cops." Then I'm taking a shit and you kicked in the door to my stall and you screamed at me, "It's gonna be the most expansive story we've ever written!" And I screamed at you, "It's not hard to be more expansive than nothing. That's like comparing the size of an atom to empty space." Then you cried and I sighed and I asked you to hand me the toilet paper. It's like trying to compare the story of a softcore porn to a hardcore porn. It's like, it's not really about that, is it? And that's the thing that I really like about FromSoft games, right? Is that they have that philosophy. I know I talked about it before, where some companies have this destructive policy to their own games, where, you know, they hit upon a successful formula and the game becomes a franchise. Because the game became a franchise because at the very core of it, the audience really liked the gameplay, right? But then these companies, these Western companies, they're so stupid about this. They feel the need to change the game from title to title because they can't just release the same game, right? Just with different content. They go and they change things. They don't keep the core gameplay and add more to it. They destructively change the core gameplay. And in effect, they change the one reason people actually play the game in the first place, or at least a large number of people. And that's not what FromSoft does. It takes what it's always done and it's added on to it. It's added more complexity slowly, you know? Like, you wouldn't think that jumping would add complexity, but it really did. So it's not really about the story, it's the gameplay, which has always puzzled me as to why they even went this route with PR in the first place. I mean, George couldn't have been cheap. If the game hadn't been bragging about its story so much, I wouldn't have even brought it up. And since they brought it up so much and have been riding the success of Game of Thrones to a likely 10-digit payout, I feel like I need to address something that literally could be addressed in any of the Dark Souls games. I've never brought up story in any of those games because it was never made a focus of those games, save for maybe Bloodborne. In fact, it tried to tell a story with its levels, its atmosphere, and with very minimalistic dialogue. But the game has been talking shit about how good its story is, so here we go. So apparently George Railroad Martin wrote this game, and that's great. I've enjoyed his work in the past. He's a character writer who excels at writing motivations and making people who do despicable things interesting and at times sympathetic. Now, I want you to picture a game like Dark Souls, which has no discernible story unless you really look hard for it, and now have it be written by an accomplished literary name. And imagine what that would look like. The brief glimpses that we get at a story are briefly experienced and hardly expanded on. And yes, if you look hard, you can find a story there, but essentially the bones of the story are the same as all the other games that came before it. Kill these 4 guys, gather the pieces of the Triforce, and go beat up Ganon in the end. The item descriptions, the brief dialogue where information is shared to you, feel like you experience it seemingly at random. It can make the story hard to follow, and none of that has changed because a competent writer is leading the story. The story never has a chance to spread its wings because story is mostly about characters, who they are, what they do, and why they do it. You don't really learn any of that in Elden Ring, and when you do, you're experiencing the telling of that story out of order, because there is no order to open world chaos. There's a reason that RPGs contrive to limit exploration options. I'm not saying that's a good thing, I'm just saying it's a thing that we should acknowledge. This is an example of the thing that we give up for the freedom to go anywhere and do anything in any order. We give up cohesion, memorable events. I can't tell you what's happened in this game so far except the broad strokes. Kill some dudes and dudettes to get the shards of a ring. I mean, I know a lot of things have happened between here and there, but the events are never as memorable as the fights I had to engage in to get there. What I remember are the enemies and the bosses and the fights and defeats along the way. The set pieces, the player's story. The one that I created is what I remember. I definitely don't remember the dialogue I exchanged with Sorcerer Roger or D. They are memorable characters, but I don't know much about them aside from how they look, because that is the power of the FromSoft team. They know how to visually design a memorable character. But I only know who the character is from what they say or secondhand descriptions from items associated with them, or the order that they belong to. The story is for the curious, but like all the other games, the story is only good if you, the player, fill in the blanks. None of this is a detractor. I don't fault the game for being this way. In fact, it's one of my favorite things about the series. I just bring it up because people are likely wondering if the writing is good because because of the name that's attached to it. And to be honest, if I didn't already know that George was involved in this game, I would not have guessed it. So the story is not the main attraction. Having George R.R. Martin write the story for a game that barely has a story is like putting Bruce Willis on the cover of a movie he's barely in. Invasions haven't been working for a lot of people. People on Reddit have been complaining about it because there isn't anything technically wrong with invasions. They just don't work like they used to because you can only invade someone under very specific conditions which aren't helped much by the open world. As far as I can tell, you cannot be invaded unless you're asking for it. By that I mean you can only be invaded if you have summoned help and are not currently in a boss fight, or if someone inexplicably used the Taunter's Tongue, which opens them up to one-on-one PvP. First question, which is a question FromSoft should have asked themselves before making this decision: why would anyone willingly open themselves up to invasion in a game where death can set you back quite a ways? If you're given the choice of going through a tough area without the risk of being invaded, aren't you going to naturally choose to not be invaded? I mean, we are pain-adverse creatures. Seems to me that logic would win over a very high percentage of the time. And the second question, and this is a bit anecdotal, so bear with me. How many times have you summoned another player to help you with anything other than a boss fight? Because I've done it exactly 3 times in the entire series of these games. If you knew that you would be invaded during a run at a level if you summon someone in, you'll likely not summon anyone, just like you wouldn't use a Taunter's Tongue unless you were looking to ambush somebody. Okay, I also have a third question. How many people did you expect to have already gotten a Taunter's Tongue by this point? I mean, you have to kill a fairly difficult Phantom in a place where people have to take a risk just by jumping off of the balcony to even engage in the fight, and if they fail, they'll likely be wary about trying again because they lost their souls the last time. How many people did you expect to have done that before they got to Godric and killed him? If your average player is anything like me, I didn't kill that Phantom until I had killed my second main boss after Godric. If even some of those players did what I did, there's a good chance that a lot less people are available by the time the player opens up the ability to invade at all. It's kind of counterintuitive. It seems like it would be a very low incidence of people invading other people's games because of the restrictions and the fact that players have to, for the first time, opt into being invaded without being given any sort of reason to engage with it, like the humanity system in DS1 and the life drain of Demon Souls in DS2. You see where I'm going with this? If you do, then you might be guessing right about now that your ability to be invaded would be severely limited, and you would be right about that. Players have been complaining since release that invasions aren't working, or that trying to invade someone crashes their game. This is a separate issue. The reason you can't invade is because of the reasons above. I've only been able to invade on PC and PS4 in very specific areas of the game, and that problem is going to get even worse once the population playing starts dying down. DS1 gave players a relatively easy way to avoid getting invaded, but would often trick players into using humanity to kindle a bonfire. When the player did this, the likelihood that they would be attacked climbed. There's nothing, as far as I can see, in Elden Ring that encourages a player to engage with PvP. And to make matters worse, if you do manage to invade someone, it'll almost always be a 2v1 with you at the disadvantage. Elden Ring is the first game to make the challenge to the invader be so obviously lopsided. The invader has always been at a disadvantage in previous Dark Souls games. That much has been true, but it's a matter of degrees. In DS1, the invading player can invade players of a higher level, which means a level 10 invader could easily invade a level 100, putting the invader at a great disadvantage. They can also invade weaker players, but not to exceed 10 levels below plus 20% of their soul level. So, a level 100 could invade a level 80 and so on. The real disadvantage is that the invading player will only have half their Estus charges, while someone who is waiting to ambush an invader may have up to 20. So clearly, if 2 players of equal skill are fighting, the one with more Estus will win every time. Many people complain online to this day that the person being invaded seems to have an infinite supply of Estus. What is most likely happening is that the player just outlasted you and you gassed out before he ran out of charges. Or the guy could be using cheat engine, which is also possible. Ah, damn it. I guess we should probably talk about that too.
Is this match cheating? Wait, is that guy cheating? He's cheating! What the fuck? That guy definitely cheating. Oh, what a sad story.
Before we go any further, there's a strange smell in the room, and we have to address the wet cat turd in the room before we can get a final verdict. Dark Souls as a whole had its multiplayer taken offline. Simultaneously, all the Soulsborne servers went down. Why was it shut down? Because someone managed to run an RCE, which is short for Remote Code Execution exploit, on people's computers. In case you don't know what that means, the moment I connect to your computer by invading you, my computer is making your computer execute a file of my choosing. That is scary shit. It works just like a real-life virus by hitching a ride on a peer-to-peer packet, like a virus attaches to a protein in a cell. To understand why this was so bad, we have to have a look-see into the past and the history of cheaters in Dark Souls games on PC. When Dark Souls came out on PC, it was cause for alarm. Players were realizing that the netcode was so bad that players were able to use cheats locally that could change the stats of players on the other side. This ranged from relatively inconvenient hacks like a player coming into your game with way more health than they normally allow, or straight up invisibility and super speed. Then the hackers figured out something else. They figured out that they could actually change the invaded player's character every time they hit them. Meaning, if a hacker hit you, they could steal your soul level and drain your stats. You know what that means, right? No? Well, that means that if your save file is on your computer and not on a server somewhere, and someone was using code to change that file on your computer, what else could they change? That brings us to today, which is approximately 10 goddamn years after FromSoft had their first sweaty-faced meeting about how the PC users are getting hacked. They had 10 goddamn years to fix a problem this neglectful. They had 10 years and 4 games to fix this issue. But instead of addressing it in, say, Dark Souls 2, they kept using the same methods that were getting people hacked, and they started piecemealing solutions together like banning players that used hacked items. Then the hackers started giving innocent players copies of those hacked items, so the innocent got banned. And, well, you've heard about this before with other games. Maybe not to this degree, but you know the story. A fly lands on a counter and the game developer kills it by throwing a grenade. I bring this up because they have just now invested in middleware to prevent hackers and cheating in what would be their most successful title ever. Let's look at all this. Every title that they've released before this has been hacked and been a PR nightmare. Perhaps nerfing the shit out of people's ability to engage in PvP is their way of putting up enough walls to play so that they can eventually justify getting rid of it completely. That's not as enticing an idea. That's not what's important. What is important is, do you think they're gonna fix the frame rate when they haven't even done the bare basic essentials to ensure that their PC players won't have a bricked computer when they try to play their games? But what's even worse is, this is why we'll never get Bloodborne on PC. Abandon all hope. What even is a 10 in this industry anymore? I mean, they gave Metal Gear Solid 5 a 10 out of 10 even though the game wasn't even finished and had a tacked on ending that didn't even come close to closing up any of the threads that came unstitched. Elden Ring is a frame rate that does its best impression of the I Love Lucy conveyor belt sketch, enemies that can Chris Angel their asses out of reality, crashes, glitches. Have the standards of the industry really fallen this low? I mean, long story short, yeah. The more complicated part of this is how reviewers get their review copies. When you get an early copy of a game, something happens to your brain. You got developers telling you that what you're about to play is a rough version of what you'll play on release. Just ignore the bugs. Most of these will be fixed on day one, but that's a lie, for the reasons I've shown you above. If that game is rough before release, it'll be rough at release. But just how rough will it be? Can you even comment on bugs if the average user is never going to see those bugs? You have no idea how many of those bugs you saw in pre-release are going to be in the release after the day one patch. So you're taking a chance telling people to buy a product that you can't attest to the quality of. Then you got to add on top of all this the fact that every one of these reviewers is trying to get their review out before anybody else, right? So they're speeding through the game. Some of these guys are even doing first impressions of the game because they're like, there's no way we can finish this game and do a full review in the 5 or 6 days that we've had to play it before it was actually released to the public, right? So these guys are all rushing to get through the damn thing. And they can't be too critical of the game, because if they are, then they might lose their rights to get that game early and they're no longer the first one out there and they lose a lot of money. Do you get the game yet? A lot of you comment that I must have a cursed PC because I run into shit that no one else does. I could intentionally censor that like other people do because maybe that's not how the vast majority of people will experience the game. Or I can make sure I give a true accounting of my experience so that people in my same situation don't make the mistake of buying something they specifically won't like or have a chance to not like because of the chance they might run into the same issues I did. So is this a 10 out of 10 game? Hell no, are you crazy? But it is close. I mean, I hate to say this because the last thing I want to do is encourage this kind of shit in the industry, but yeah, I'd say this game, even in its current state, is at least an 8 out of 10, but damn close to a 7. If the frame stutter and generally poor performance weren't an issue, this game would be a 9.5 for me. Damn close to perfection. If they do somehow pull off a miracle and fix this frame rate shit before people move on from the game, the community is likely to reward them with loyalty. Or, FromSoft can go the way of the dodo and pull a Cyberpunk. Let's hope they don't. Now, normally, I would end the video there, but I had this nagging feeling from the moment I wrote this script to now, when I have been finalizing and recording the narration. See, this frame rate thing with the disappearing enemies, it happened way more frequently when I was streaming the game than when I was playing offline. Because when I was playing without recording, the game was running at over 30 frames per second, and at times would hover around 40 frames. Still, the fluctuations were at times severe, even offline, and there were a few occasions where the enemies would disappear even if I wasn't recording. That nagging feeling specifically was a question. Did none of these people review the PC version of this game? I mean, if so, way to fumble the ball, but I have a hard time understanding how that's even possible. So I spent the entire day rewiring my desk, installing a capture card in my PC, and making room for my PS4 on the desk. I even bought the game a second time on PS4. What did I find out? I booted up the game and I did the tutorial. Got a parry on the first hit with the boss and quickly put him down. The frame rate was high, the controls felt responsive, and I had yet to get hit by an attack I swear I dodged. Everything was going great, then I had a bad feeling, but I pushed on. The weird thing was, up until this point, I had just been getting by in fights. Scraping by, I mean. Doing huge chunks of damage to end fights early was my MO on PC because, well, frankly, the game was too unreliable for the battle to draw out all that long. And every time I'd win against a difficult boss, it was like a photo finish. Right down to each of us having like one hit of HP left. Those fights were intense and oh so satisfying, but I couldn't help but feel like I was doing something wrong because it shouldn't be this hard to progress. On PS4, however, there was none of that. I was going into boss rooms with a half a health bar and one flash charge and still managing to kill the boss. Most of the time on the first try, others on the second. I was doing things I never tried before, like jump attacking in the middle of a boss's combo, and the combat felt easy until I reached the main story bosses, and it was there that everything just sort of clicked. That's when I realized that it was a mistake to experience the game on PC first, because it negatively colored my experience with it, and this game, no matter how good it is, can't escape the taint of that initial experience. I'll always remember it as a game that I was most disappointed to play for the first time. But now that I've experienced the game on PS4, I could safely say that there's still a chance that this could be my favorite game of all time. Final verdict, I give the PC version of this game like an 8 out of 10. Yes, it was slow. Yes, it pissed me off. Yes, it crashed and it was buggy as hell. But the base game is so good that I was willing to put up with the bugs, and in fact, despite the bugs, I looked forward to playing the game every single day. So if you only have a PC and no consoles, I'm sorry. Wait a few months and see what FromSoft does. If they fix it, give them some scritches behind the ear and tell them what a good boy they've been. If you have a PS4, then I highly recommend you get this game and play it on that console because it is one of the best games I've played since Demon's Souls, and for me, that's saying a lot. PS4 version of the game gets a solid 9 out of 10. It would have been higher, but the frame rate still fluctuates and it does crash on occasion. So it can't be a 10 out of 10. I mean, a 10 out of 10 is unachievable. For something to have no faults at all, it's impossible. You can have a nearly perfect ass, but it's still gonna stink like shit every once in a while. You know what I'm saying?